The sea before dawn was a mirror of black glass. The air hung thick with the scent of salt and fuel, the low hum of engines pulsing like a distant heartbeat beneath the surface. Somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible in the darkness, a storm of steel and fire was preparing to awaken. It was not the kind of storm born from clouds or wind. It was man-made, calculated, deliberate, merciless. The Pacific had seen countless nights like this, but this one would be remembered as the hour when 4 proud warships vanished before they ever truly understood what struck them. To the Japanese sailors aboard their destroyers and cruisers, the early hours of dawn were familiar, routine even. They had been taught discipline in the face of fatigue, obedience over doubt, and courage over fear. The code of Bushido still whispered in their hearts, even as radar, aircraft, and oil replaced swords and armor. These were men born into a world that believed honor and death were close companions. They stood on deck in the cold air, scanning the horizon, never imagining that death could come from 23 miles away, from a weapon so far beyond their reach that it might as well have been the fist of the gods. In the west, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the American task force had been stalking them. The night-cloaked giants of steel, Iowa-class and South Dakota-class battleships, the ultimate expression of industrial might and naval supremacy. Each ship carried weapons the size of city buses, shells as heavy as small cars. The 16-inch naval guns were not simply artillery, they were cathedrals of destruction, able to hurl a 1-ton shell over the curve of the earth. When they spoke, the ocean itself trembled. But that morning, silence reigned. Aboard the USS Iowa, the crew moved with a practiced calm that came only from endless drills and battles already survived. Men checked elevation charts, rangefinders, and weather reports. Radar operators watched the blips on their screens like surgeons studying a patient's heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside the ship, in a cramped plotting room glowing with red light, officers murmured coordinates, aligning steel and fire with mathematics and precision. They knew what was out there. Japanese vessels caught in retreat, unaware that the long arm of American gunnery had reached a new kind of perfection. This was not a skirmish, it was an execution written in silence before sunrise. Far across the water, aboard the Japanese cruiser Kumano, Captain Masao Kimura studied the horizon through his binoculars. He had commanded through chaos before, in the Philippines, in the South China Sea, through the constant aerial attacks that had turned once mighty fleets into ghosts. Yet he believed in the training, in the precision of his men, in the strength of steel forged by his nation. Around him, the ship's crew prepared for another long day of evasion, keeping formation with the remaining vessels of their group, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Mogami. Their mission was desperate, to regroup and protect what little remained of Japan's naval power after the crushing defeats of 1944. They knew American aircraft dominated the skies, but on this quiet morning, no planes appeared. The horizon seemed safe, deceptively safe. The sky began to pale. A thin silver line appeared where sea met air. Dawn crept in gently, brushing the waves with light. For the Japanese, it felt like a small mercy. Another day survived, another chance to escape detection. For the Americans, it was the signal they'd been waiting for. In the plotting rooms, orders tightened in the focus. The radar echoes had solidified. Targets confirmed. Distance, 23 miles. Bearing, steady. Wind, minimal. The command came softly, but carried the weight of fate. Open fire. The first salvo erupted like the birth of a new sun. Flames burst from the gun barrels, followed by a thunder that split the air and shook the ocean. The sound rolled for miles, echoing between waves, like the roar of an angry god. From the Japanese decks, sailors turned their heads in confusion. There had been no warning, no aircraft, no approaching silhouettes. Just a strange flicker on the horizon. Then, moments later, a distant howl, unlike anything they had heard before. The shells were already in flight, invisible arcs slicing through the morning sky at twice the speed of sound. 23 miles away, they were little more than specks of steel, until gravity turned them into meteors. The first shell struck the sea beside Kumano, sending a column of water hundreds of feet high. A heartbeat later, the second slammed into the deck, detonating with a white flash that vaporized metal and men alike. The concussion tore through compartments, shattering bulkheads, igniting fuel.
The ship lurched violently, smoke pouring from its midsection. Panic rippled through the crew. No one could see where the attack was coming from. Some shouted about aircraft, others believed submarines had found them. But the truth was stranger. Death had arrived from beyond the horizon, from ships they couldn't even see, too powerful to comprehend. On board the USS Iowa, the gunnery crews reloaded with mechanical precision. Each 2,700-pound shell was hoisted, rammed, and sealed into the breech with the rhythm of a machine powered by adrenaline and duty. The fire control officer adjusted the elevation by fractions of a degree. Shift 100 yards starboard, fire for effect. Another volley screamed into the sky. Each round spent was another heartbeat closer to annihilation for the enemy. The ocean became a graveyard of geysers. Japanese ships twisted, turned, tried to break formation, but every maneuver was futile. The shells fell faster than commands could be shouted. Suzuya caught a near miss that tore open her hull, steam bursting from the engine room. Chikuma tried to lay smoke, her crew coughing in the choking fumes, but the next impact ripped through her bow, tearing it open like paper. Communication broke down as shockwaves rattled every structure. To the sailors trapped below decks, it felt as though the sea itself had turned against them. No warning, no target to fight, only the sound of distant thunder, followed by destruction. Captain Kimura staggered to his feet, blood streaking his face from shattered glass. Through the smoke, he could barely make out his sister ships. He shouted, "Report damage!" but the radio crackled with static. Officers screamed damage control orders. Pumps roared, hoses hissed. Men ran through corridors ankle-deep in oil and water. Above deck, gunners manned their stations instinctively, scanning the skies for planes that weren't there. Somewhere, someone shouted, "Enemy battleships! Over the horizon!" The realization spread like fire. They were being shelled by ghosts, by ships too far to see, too powerful to comprehend. For the Americans, it was precision turned into poetry, deadly, merciless poetry. Spotter aircraft from carriers far behind the line circled high above, radioing corrections to the gunners below. 1,000 yards short, adjust. The next salvo landed true. Kumano erupted in flames. The impact shattered its central turret. Fragments of armor plate sliced through the bridge. The sea glowed orange with fire and oil. Men threw themselves overboard to escape the heat, only to be dragged under by suction as compartments flooded. In the plotting rooms of the Iowa, there was no celebration, just calm efficiency. The enemy blips faded from the radar, one by one. Coordinates confirmed, hits verified, range recalculated. The captain gave a quiet nod. Not triumph, but acknowledgement of duty done. He knew what it meant to command such power, that somewhere across the horizon, hundreds of men were dying without ever seeing the faces of those who killed them. War had become mathematics, stripped of valor, purified into efficiency. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Mogami, burning fiercely, tried to limp eastward, smoke pouring from her funnels. Her captain refused to abandon ship, standing by the wheel until flames consumed the bridge. Suzuya exploded soon after, her ammunition stores igniting in a flash that lit the dawn brighter than the sun. The explosion was so violent that observers on the American ships felt the concussion through the hull. Pieces of her deck rained down like metallic rain upon the sea. Of the 4 ships, only scattered survivors clung to debris calling for help that would never come. And then, silence again. The ocean returned to calm, as if nothing had happened. The smoke drifted, the echoes faded, and dawn broke in full, soft golden light spreading across a sea now littered with wreckage. Seagulls circled above, their cries sharp and indifferent. The world had changed forever in those few minutes. The Japanese sailors who survived floated in shock, staring at the rising sun on the horizon, the very symbol of their empire, now reflected in an ocean of fire. Aboard the American battleships, the men stood at their posts, breathing heavily, and the ringing in their ears slowly fading. Some cheered quietly, others just stared. Even victory, when it came at such distance, felt hollow. They had not fought men face to face. They had ended lives with the turn of a dial, the press of a button. Technology had replaced bravery. Precision had replaced passion. And though they did not know it yet, this kind of warfare would soon define the modern age. The radio crackled with confirmation. Enemy formation destroyed, no further resistance. The admiral issued a simple reply: cease fire. The great guns, smoking and warm, fell silent once more. The ocean swallowed the last echoes of thunder. The men below deck began cleaning their stations, reloading, resetting, as if nothing had happened. But above, on the deck of the Iowa, one young sailor stared out over the horizon, whispering to no one in particular. "They never even saw us." And in that whisper, the tragedy of war, its awe and its horror, found its truest voice.
Smoke lingered on the horizon long after the thunder ceased. The waves rolled gently now, as if mocking the violence that had just passed. The sea was calm, but beneath its skin drifted debris, oil, and silence. The silence of hundreds who would never speak again. It was a silence that stretched farther than the ocean itself, reaching into the hearts of those who had witnessed it from both sides. For the Japanese sailors who survived, clinging to floating wreckage and scorched wood, the Pacific no longer felt like water. It felt like judgment, vast, cold, and eternal. Hours later, as daylight burned away the last remnants of dawn, the true scale of destruction revealed itself. The once proud ships of the Japanese fleet, Kumano, Susuya, Mogami, Shikuma, were gone. Not crippled, not limping home, but gone. What had been a fleet was now a graveyard scattered across miles of sea. Survivors floated alone in patches, coughing through oil and salt, searching the horizon for rescue that would not come. Their uniforms, once symbols of discipline, now clung heavy with seawater and ash. Some called for help, others prayed. A few stared silently into the distance, unable to reconcile that the empire they had sworn to protect could fall so swiftly, so completely, to an enemy they had never seen. In the ruins of one lifeboat, Petty Officer Akira Saito sat clutching a piece of wood that might once have been part of the bridge. His hands were burned. His ears still rang from the explosions. He remembered the faces of men he had spoken to only hours before, gone in a flash of fire and steam. He looked up at the sky, now impossibly blue, and whispered a question that had no answer. Where did it come from? It was the same question every survivor asked. They knew the Americans had powerful guns, but not like this, not weapons that could kill from beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond hope. Far away, aboard the Iowa, sailors gathered on deck, as the morning sun revealed the distant smudge of smoke marking where their shells had fallen. The air still carried the faint scent of cordite and iron. They knew they had achieved something historic, a naval bombardment at a range few believed possible. Some smiled, others remained quiet. Even among victors there was a heaviness, a realization that this was no longer the age of heroes charging under banners, but of invisible death delivered by machines. Lieutenant Commander Mark Harlan, standing near the gunnery tower, turned to his men and said quietly, "We just ended a battle before it even began." His words were not prideful. They were mournful. The radio room crackled with intercepted transmissions, Japanese distress calls, broken and desperate, scattered across frequencies. A few messages were clear enough to translate. Ship sinking, heavy casualties, no enemy in sight. The operators paused, headphones pressed tight, faces pale. They were hearing the voices of men who had no idea what had hit them, voices fading one by one into static. The commander ordered the recordings archived, not out of cruelty, but because history demanded to remember. Even in war, respect lingered for those who fought with conviction, no matter their flag. Back in Japan, the Imperial Navy headquarters received the first fragmented reports that morning. Lines of communication were broken, messages incomplete. Admirals gathered around tables covered with maps, their faces drawn, their tea untouched. At first they believed it was an airstrike. "No, it was the Americans' new guns," one officer said softly, the disbelief in his voice betraying the truth that Japan's navy was no longer simply losing battles, it was losing the future. For decades, Japan had built its power upon mastery of the sea, from the victory at Tsushima against Russia in 1905 to the surprise at Pearl Harbor in 1941. The sea had been their pride, their protector, their domain. Now, it was their undoing.
As the day stretched on, rescue attempts began, though few succeeded. American reconnaissance aircraft circling the area dropped life rafts for survivors when they could. Some pilots reported seeing men wave in exhaustion before slipping beneath the waves. Others saw wreckage drift into flames as oil caught light again. War had reduced human courage to small dots on an endless sea. Among the survivors eventually rescued by Japanese submarines days later was Ensign Hiroshi Nakata. In his report, written weeks after, he described the bombardment in words that would haunt historians. There was no warning. The sea exploded. We could not see where death came from. The shells fell from the sky as if the heavens themselves were collapsing. I thought perhaps the gods were angry. His words captured not only confusion, but awe, the sense that mankind had reached a level of destruction beyond comprehension. The Japanese Navy had faced defeat before, but never annihilation at such distance, such precision. Meanwhile, American engineers and gunnery officers analyzed the engagement with cold efficiency. Charts were drawn, firing tables refined, and new doctrines drafted. They celebrated technological triumph, but among the sailors, the ones who had pulled the triggers, there was little joy. Private diaries later revealed that many could not forget the sound of their guns. One wrote, "You feel the deck tremble, and you know someone miles away will die. You don't see him, you don't hear him, but he's there, and you did that." These were not words of guilt, but of awakening, the beginning of a moral reckoning with what warfare had become. In Tokyo, the loss of 4 cruisers barely made it to the public. The government had long since learned to bury bad news beneath layers of rhetoric. Newspapers spoke of temporary setbacks and valiant resistance. But the officers who read the internal reports knew better. Japan's naval soul had been cracked. The ocean, once their greatest ally, now belonged to the enemy. With each passing month, America's industrial power seemed limitless. Ships replaced faster than Japan could sink them. Guns larger than any Japan could build. Range and radar precision improving with every battle. The Pacific had turned into a factory of inevitability. For the Japanese officers still at sea, each sunrise brought dread instead of hope. They had once taken pride in their skill at night battles, their stealth, their cunning. But now the Americans saw in darkness, struck from beyond vision. The Empire's warriors, trained to die for honor, found themselves dying without purpose, their courage wasted against an enemy they could not touch. Yet still they fought. Bushido demanded it. To surrender was shame. To retreat was unthinkable. They followed orders not out of blind obedience, but out of a tragic sense of duty. Even as ships burned around them, they whispered the same word that had guided samurai centuries before: endure. On the American side, there was admiration even in victory. They don't quit, one officer noted in his log. They keep fighting even when there's nothing left to fight with. For some, it was respect. For others, it was confusion. How could men continue when the outcome was so hopeless? But to the Japanese, the war was not simply about victory. It was about the preservation of spirit, of honor, of the unbroken soul. That spirit, however, was now being tested in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. As night fell again over the Pacific, the surviving Japanese ships regrouped in silence. The radio calls were brief, voices hoarse, words few. No one spoke of the losses. Everyone already knew. They buried the dead at sea, chanting prayers as the bodies slipped into the dark water. Each splash echoed against the hulls like a drumbeat for the fallen. "Forgive us," one captain whispered, bowing to the ocean. "We could not protect them." The ocean gave no reply. It had long since chosen sides. On the American flagship, the mood was not of celebration but contemplation. The captain walked the deck alone, the stars reflected in the water below. He thought of the men he had killed, men who never saw his face. He thought of the distance, 23 miles, and how easily such distance numbed the human soul. War at that range was clean, almost clinical. But the ocean never forgets. It holds every echo, every scream, every fragment of steel. He looked eastward towards Japan and knew the war was not over. The guns had proven their power, but the spirit of the enemy remained unbroken. That spirit, he realized, was what made the Pacific such a cruel teacher. By the time reports reached Washington, the battle was already being framed as another milestone, proof of American superiority, evidence of industrial dominance. Photographs of the Iowa's massive guns circulated in newspapers, symbols of victory. But what those photos never showed were the faces of the men who watched their targets burn, nor the quiet moments afterwards when the guns cooled and the silence returned. The war machine had no space for reflection. Reflection was for later, for historians, for survivors, for a world trying to make sense of the senseless. And so the ocean carried on, indifferent. The wrecks sank deeper, disappearing into darkness, their twisted metal becoming homes for fish and coral. The Pacific, vast and ancient, reclaimed them, as it always does. But the echoes remained, in the memories of survivors, in the nightmares of gunners, in the pages of history books yet to be written. The Japanese Navy had reached its doom not because it lacked courage, but because courage alone could not stop the march of progress. When night fully descended and the horizon vanished into shadow once more, the survivors aboard scattered Japanese vessels stared into the dark, their eyes hollow but unbroken. Some whispered prayers to the ancestors. Others remained silent, knowing words could not bridge the distance between pride and despair. They had seen the impossible, ships destroyed by unseen hands from 23 miles away.
And in that impossible moment, they glimpsed the end not just of a battle, but of an era. The age of close combat was over. The age of distance had begun. And in that distance, humanity itself had begun to blur. In the years that followed that dawn of doom, the waves that swallowed those ships became sacred. Fishermen avoided the area for years, whispering that the spirits of the sailors still drifted beneath. Divers who ventured down decades later spoke of eerie silence, wrecks lying upright on the seabed, guns still pointed toward the horizon as if waiting for an enemy who would never come. The ocean had entombed not just ships, but a generation's faith in invincibility. For Japan, the loss was more than steel and men. It was the death of an illusion, the belief that sheer will and courage could overcome any weapon, any enemy, any storm. When word of the annihilation finally reached Tokyo in full, the shock rippled through corridors of power and hearts of ordinary citizens alike. There were no headlines, no public funerals. The empire's propaganda machine spun silence into pride, turning absence into myth. They spoke of heroes who vanished in glory, but beneath those polished phrases was a quiet terror. If such destruction could come unseen from beyond sight, what chance did any fleet have? Admirals sat in dim-lit rooms staring at maps that no longer meant anything. Every strategy, every doctrine built over decades had been rendered obsolete by the thunder of guns from 23 miles away. The sea, once the empire's greatest strength, had become its executioner. Survivors like Ensign Hiroshi Nakata returned home months later, thin, haunted, and hollow-eyed. He would sit in silence during family meals, flinching at the sound of thunder. In his hometown, people welcomed him as a hero, but he felt like a ghost wearing his own name. When he walked along the harbor, the smell of salt and diesel brought everything back. The screams, the fire, the endless sky raining metal. He could not explain it to anyone. How could he? They had not seen their comrades vanish in seconds without ever seeing the enemy's face. In his private diary he wrote, "It was not a battle. It was a sentence carried out by gods of iron." He never went to sea again. But history, indifferent and relentless, moved on. The Americans pressed forward, each victory faster, more efficient, more distant. Technology had changed war into something mechanical, a matter of mathematics, logistics, trajectory. And yet in that cold precision, something human was being lost. Among American officers, a new kind of reflection began to emerge. They had witnessed what power could do, but also what it could erase. In letters home, sailors described watching the horizon light up like sunrise, knowing that sunrise meant death for someone far away. "It's strange," one wrote to his wife. "You pull a lever and miles away a man disappears. You never see his eyes, but you feel them in your dreams." The Pacific, once filled with fleets clashing under banners and courage, had become a chessboard of machines. Yet amid that, respect,
A quiet, unspoken respect began to grow. American sailors would recover Japanese lifeboats and treat survivors with the same water and bandages they used for their own. Many had grown up hearing propaganda that the enemy was savage, inhuman. But when they looked at the men shivering before them, young, frightened, desperate, they realized that war was just young men killing other young men who could have been their friends in another life. Humanity, buried under uniforms and orders, surfaced again in brief moments between the explosions. For Japan, the lessons of that morning at sea did not end with the war. They became a shadow that followed the nation into its surrender, into its rebirth. When the emperor's voice finally echoed through radio speakers in August 1945, announcing the unthinkable, surrender, men like Nakata bowed their heads not only in shame but in relief. The war had begun with pride and ended with exhaustion, but from that exhaustion came clarity. The 16-inch guns that struck from 23 miles away had done more than destroy ships. They had shattered an entire worldview. They had shown that war was no longer about bravery, but about who controlled the horizon, who could kill without being seen. And in that realization, Japan began to turn away from war itself. In the ruins of cities and the quiet of temples, a new philosophy began to grow. The same discipline that had once fueled warriors now built engineers, artists, and teachers. The same pride that had once served empire now served craft and innovation. Japan, broken and humbled, began to rebuild not from arrogance, but from reflection. Factories rose where battleships had fallen. Children learned not of conquest, but of cooperation. The spirit of Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior, did not die, it was reborn, purified through suffering. Its new form no longer demanded death for honor, but excellence in peace. Years later, as the world entered the atomic age, historians would look back at the Doom at Dawn as a turning point, not just in tactics, but in psychology. It was the moment when distance became the new face of war. The gunners on the Iowa, firing blind into the horizon, were the ancestors of the missile operators who would one day press buttons from thousands of miles away. The battle had foretold the future, a future where war would be fought by ghosts, where destruction would come without warning or sight. And for Japan, that lesson came at the cost of 4 ships and 1,000 souls. In museums today, rusted fragments of those ships rest in glass cases. Visitors walk past them, reading the plaques, whispering about history. But for those who understand, the real story is not about the technology, nor the strategy, nor even the tragedy. It is about transformation, about how a nation learned that true strength is not in striking first, but in standing up again after the storm. The survivors lived to see their country become a land of peace, innovation, and humility. They saw Tokyo rise from ashes. They saw ships of trade replace ships of war. And when they spoke of the past, they spoke softly, not with bitterness, but with reverence for the lessons paid in blood. Akira Saito, who had once floated on wreckage that morning, lived into his 90s. In his final interview, decades later, he said, "The Americans thought they defeated us that day. They were wrong. We defeated ourselves, our pride, our blindness. That was necessary, because only then could we be reborn." His words carried the weight of generations. He did not speak with anger, but with peace. The sea that had once taken everything from him had become his teacher. He would often walk along the beach at dawn, watching the light on the water, and bow for the ones who never came home, and for the lesson they left behind. In the end, the story of that dawn is not one of victors and victims, but of revelation. It showed the world the terrible beauty of progress, how knowledge and invention, when divorced from wisdom, can make gods of men and ghosts of their enemies. It showed that courage, though noble, cannot outpace the speed of change. And it showed that the line between honor and destruction is thinner than smoke on the horizon. The ocean remembers. It always does. Beneath the waves, the wrecks still rest in silence, not as monuments to defeat, but as reminders. Reminders of how far humanity can go and how far it can fall. Fish swim through gun barrels now. Coral grows over steel meant to kill. Nature, indifferent and eternal, has forgiven what men could not. The Pacific has turned their graves into gardens, and somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of early morning, when the sky blushes the same color as that long-ago dawn, the souls of those sailors, American and Japanese alike, drift together beneath the light. No longer enemies, no longer soldiers, just men, return to the same sea that once divided them. The horizon between them, once filled with fire, now glows with peace. So when you hear the distant sound of thunder at sea, remember there was a time when that thunder was made by men, and it changed the world. It ended one kind of strength and began another. The doom at dawn was not just the death of ships, but the birth of wisdom. For in the silence that followed, Japan and the world learned that true victory is not in how far your guns can reach, but in how deeply your heart can understand.